Welcome. We're so glad you're here with us for today's Harper Lecture. The Harper Lecture series began in 1979 with Hannah Holborn Gray speaking in San Francisco. As the need for critical thought remains apparent in all areas of life, we proudly continue this signature program to bring you stimulating conversations and fresh ideas. Thank you once more for joining us. We couldn't do this without you.
Welcome, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, or morning. This is a global event, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are joining today. I am Dalita Balasanian. I'm a member of UChicago's Global University-wide Alumni Board, former president of the Alumni Club of New York City, and a proud college alum. And I'm thrilled to welcome you all tonight to tonight's Harper Lecture on climate change and renewable energy with Professors Elisabeth Moyer and Mark Templeton. I am super happy that we're continuing these virtual Harper Lectures as we at the University of Chicago continue the tradition of the relentless pursuit of knowledge, of critical thought, and of the life of the mind. Now, many of you are used to in-person Harper Lectures, where sometimes we might give you refreshments. Sadly, we don't have those here today, but feel free to grab your favorite UChicago mug and enjoy the refreshment of your choice in your office or your home. This evening, we are immensely privileged to hear from not just one, but two UChicago professors. So thank you, Professor Moyer and Professor Templeton. You see them both on your screens right now. We're delighted to have you here. We would like to take a moment to briefly introduce our speakers for today. Professor Moyer, as you see right here, is an associate professor in the Department of the Geophysical Sciences and has led the University Center for Robust Decision-Making on Climate and Energy Policy, the PhD training program on data science for energy and environmental research, and the PIRE-CIRRUS International Collaboration to study high-altitude clouds. Her research interests span climate statistics, climate impacts, energy systems, and atmospheric measurements from high-altitude aircraft. She was a member of the High-Level Commission on Carbon Prices and the World Bank Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition in 2016. She is a founder and faculty director of the university's Environmental Frontiers undergraduate research program to give students practical experience with energy analysis. Now, turning to Professor Mark N. Templeton. Professor Templeton is a clinical professor at the University of Chicago Law School, director of the law school's Abrams Environmental Law Clinic, which he founded 12 years ago, and a research affiliate of the Energy Policy Institute of the University of Chicago, otherwise called EPIC. Immediately prior to that, he was a trustee and executive director of the Office of Independent Trustees for the $20 billion Deepwater Horizon Oil Spill Trust. He has also served as the cabinet-level director of the Missouri Department of Natural Resources, an associate dean and the COO of Yale Law School, his alma mater, a consultant at McKinsey and Company, a senior policy advisor at the US State Department, and a financial analyst at Goldman Sachs. In addition to his teaching and research responsibilities at the University of Chicago, he serves as a board member of the Environmental Law Institute, the Gaylord and Dorothy Donnelly Foundation, and as the vice chair of the Conservation and Policy Council of the Cook County Forest Preserves. Now, in terms of the format for tonight, we will first hear the presentation by the professors, and we will then open the floor to the audience for any questions. So please enter your questions in the Q&A box below. But without further ado, please join me with virtual applause. I think I can hear you in welcoming Professors Moyer and Templeton to the virtual stage. Professors, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. My name is Liz Moyer, as I've been introduced, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about climate change, but mostly about energy transitions, because that's something that I've been working on. And I think that it's most interesting for you guys to see the research that faculty are doing personally. Just to remind you that climate change, whatever else you may think about it, projected climate change will be economically disruptive to humans. And I'm showing you here just a figure that comes from a paper that we recently published with a graduate student, where we were looking at changes in optimal growing zones for agriculture. And what I'm showing you here is the change in the growing season temperature in the Midwest maize belt So this benchmark to Iowa, where it's a maximum productivity for maize, and it's showing you the projected end of century change in growing season temperature under sort of the multi-model mean for sort of standard climate models. And you would see about a 5-degree change in that temperature, which means the normal temperatures at which you'd grow maize are moving up into Canada. And what we found is, as you might expect, if you allow farmers to adjust their planting dates in agricultural models, the optimal zone for growing maize does indeed shift out of the US and up into Canada. So things like that. There are a million ways in which climate change can affect humans and natural systems, but we should all agree that we're used to this world working the way it works and being the way it is, and changes tend to be disruptive to society. So with that in mind, the question is, what do we do about it? And this is where I've been very interested in projections of how we might get out of climate change and what that really means. So I want to show you results from a few projects assessing if we were to try to prevent climate change from happening, CO2 related human-induced climate change, what infrastructure would need to be changed to produce an energy transition now? And in fact, how has the energy system changed in the past? And how would future proposed transitions and policy relevant proposed transitions compare to past ones? So I'm just going to show you here a little video of the first animation or the first visual tool that we built. And in my usual research life, when I'm doing interesting projects that are kind of side projects, I tend to just want to make the video, want to make the visualization that if I can't find one, I'll make the thing that I'm looking for. And what I really wanted to know is, what is the infrastructure that supports our economy now? So this is an assessment of all long-lived energy-related infrastructure in the United States. It's benchmarked in the year 2012, just because it took us a long time to do, and that's when we got it started. And this is an animation of actually going through and updating, and you can see the incredible richness of infrastructure, which mostly you don't pay attention to, that underlies our current lifestyle. And much of this would have to be changed in the future. So when you add it all up and compute the replacement value of what we have, and we think about how we might change, we find that the total energy infrastructure replacement value, that's not its depreciated value, which is about half that, but the replacement cost at current prices is about $10 trillion, so about $30,000 per person. And that's not at all surprising. That's very much in line with what I would have estimated, what I did estimate just on the back of an envelope. And of that amount, over 6 trillion is just 6.4 trillion in 2012 was purely related to fossil fuels and would have to switch in a zero carbon emissions world. So this is kind of our benchmark for thinking about, what we might do in the future. We've built up this tremendous wealth where economy is underpinned by energy infrastructure. And if we're going to change it in the future, this is the scale of infrastructure we have to change. So I'm showing you here, I updated this slide just to show you what's happened between 2012 when we started this project in 2021. And the answer is we've swapped about $200 billion of infrastructure from fossil specific to mostly coal to renewables, which is mostly wind and solar. And that's 200 billion out of 10 trillion. So you can see we're progressing naturally without even much policy toward a world that's higher in renewables, but not very fast. So then I'm going to show you another animation here. And again, this is an interactive visualization that you can play with yourself, but this is just a GIF that I made of the actual animation. And this is how we built up that infrastructure from the year 1800 onward. And nothing looks like it's happening now, but that's because for a long time, the US was purely agrarian. It's only after the Civil War, which is kicking in now, that you start to see us develop much of an industry at all. And at that point, we also start getting coal. So watch how fast the changes come and how complete they are. By around 1910, the economy is dominated by coal, and coal dominates every single sector. Once we have the coal crisis in the 1910s, we start to get a lot more oil coming in. And as you'll see, the Great Depression has happened. We had a bobble. World War II just happened. Post-World War II, we get the build out of natural gas. In the 60s, we get electricity. Nuclear comes in and then stagnates, never really gets very far. And then watch what happens after fracking comes in. Look at what happens to coal in the electric sector. So that's where we are now. We are in an energy transition. Coal was extirpated from every single sector except for electricity. It went to electricity and now it's dying. So let me continue forward to just show you what this looks like now. So what I wanted, the reason I want to emphasize this is it's important when we think about whether energy transitions are scary or whether future policies are alarming, to realize we've been through dramatic energy transitions in the past. And in fact, we're in the middle of one now, and probably most people have never even noticed. So this is what happened to coal since 1800. Big burst of use, again, associated with the railroads. There's required midstream infrastructure to move the energy around. And then coal, we show you in black, is all coal usage except for in the electric sector. It almost died out, but it finds a second wind when we grow the electric sector, and it has its peak there around 2000, and now it's dying again. Why is it dying? Because natural gas got cheaper. Purely normal economic market forces. So what you may not realize, again, since the year 2012, since we started this project, from 2012, I'm showing you coal mines here, and the size of each dot is a measure of the capacity of that coal mine. So this is 2012, and this is 2021. We lost half of our coal mines. We lost a third of our capacity for producing coal, just from purely market forces. Same with coal-fired power plants. Here's 2012, and here's 2021. Half the plants are shut, a third of our coal capacity is lost. What did that get replaced with? Mostly about half natural gas and the rest wind and solar. And that's all happening just on its own. So if you want to go look at that infrastructure visualization, we don't have the historical part yet, but we have a whole team of UChicago undergrads digitizing old maps of pipelines. And so our hope is in about a year, we'll be able to show you from 1800 on the growth of infrastructure, and then we'll be able to project on future proposed policies. So just to remind everybody, so climate solutions lie in infrastructure. Energy transitions are the norm in US history. We're in one now. The infrastructure value associated with energy production is nearly half of GDP. And that infrastructure sets the speed and timing of any transition. The current US pathway to low carbon energy system is possible, but it's going slow. The infrastructure value in dollars per watt is not declining. There's no indication that we can get away with having less stuff in the future. So we support our wonderful lifestyles with a lot of stuff, and we have to change that stuff. And that's going to be what the future is about, less so arguing about the exact nature of climate change and more the fine details of how do we decommission some things, introduce new things, what are the economic incentives? And so with that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to Mark Templeton, who is the person who can tell you how all that happens. If we're going to make this transition, how will it happen? Mark is the guy who can say how it will play out.
What we see here is, again, I just want to kind of ground everybody in the fact that the U.S. economy, obviously, in the world economy actually generates greenhouse gas emissions through a number of different sectors. We're talking primarily about the electric power sector. But one thing that's important to bear in mind is the idea that we're going to need to electrify all energy and all of our uses of energy. So what you see is kind of the transportation sector right now at about 28% of greenhouse gas emissions. We're going to have to tackle that sector as well as the industrial sector, right? Steel production, cement production, and we're going to need to make progress on those areas as well, largely by the idea of electrifying everything, which we'll talk further about. I want to talk about a couple of kind of regulatory drivers as well. So as Liz said, the economics were changing, right? Fracking vastly reduced the price of gas. Gas was cheap, so we turned towards gas as a replacement for coal. There's also some regulatory actions that have been taking place as well. I'm going to talk about at the federal level for just a moment. So the Biden administration is undertaking a number of different efforts that are pushing the electric power sector away from coal and towards cleaner forms of energy. So some of you may recall that under the Obama administration, they proposed something called the Clean Power Plan that was going to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from existing coal-fired power plants. The Supreme Court stayed and then rejected those efforts in litigation. But the Biden administration has promised to undertake a new effort, and it seems like every week we're going to hear it's next week. But the latest is that next week we should hear from the Biden administration a new greenhouse gas emissions rule for the electric power sector. What we are hearing is that is going to require carbon capture to be implemented at existing coal and natural gas facilities, as well as at new natural gas facilities. This would be a big change. In some ways, it's a reaction to what the Supreme Court said previously, which is that regulation really needs to take place at every single power plant. The view of EPA and others is that now that there are incentives built into the Inflation Reduction Act that passed and is rolling out, that changes some of the economics of carbon capture at these particular plants. There's a lot still to be worked out. I mean, in terms of, we'll have to see what's in the rule. One of the tricky issues is that some of these power plants are not run as frequently. They're called peakers, so their pollution impact is limited. Question then is, where are they actually polluting? And a lot of these peakers are actually in low-income communities of color. And so that really poses a deep question, right, for those people who are committed to both changing our electric system, but who also have a commitment to, racial and economic justice as well. So it's going to be really interesting to kind of see how the Biden administration proposes this rule dealing with carbon capture, probably for the vast majority of plants, but maybe accepting out some of those what are called peaking plants for that purpose. US EPA Administrator Michael Regan proposed essentially using all of EPA's tools to move the power sector towards a healthier system for providing electricity. So while a lot of people have been focused on the greenhouse gas emission rule, there are a couple of other rules as well. So one rule is called the Good Neighbor Rule. This rule regulates the emission of certain pollutants. And what it does is basically power plants in one state emit nitrous oxides that then kind of drift downwind. Under the Good Neighbor Rule, they're not supposed to do that. As a result of this particular rule, it's expected that we're going to see the implementation of this rule. We'll see a reduction of about 13% of existing coal-fired power plants. That's even regardless of what happens with the greenhouse gas emission rule in terms of its requirements, or whether the courts uphold that. Similarly, the mercury and air toxics standard rule limits the emission of mercury and other air toxics. Under EPA's current proposal for that, it would only require a kind of slight reduction in new technologies would be deployed in existing plants. There might be some shuttering of plants. But if EPA were to actually adopt a more stringent rule, which actually advocates would propose, again, you'd see roughly a 10 to 13% decline in the existing coal-fired power plants. So my point here really is that EPA is using a number of tools to push that will have the effect of reducing emissions from coal-fired power plants, whether it's toxics or other pollutants or greenhouse gases emissions directly. So that's going to encourage the growth of and deployment of renewables as well. Interestingly, kind of speaking back to the Inflation Reduction Act, the U.S. Energy Information Agency modeled what the impacts would be on the solar sector, and they estimated almost 300 gigawatt kind of addition because of the Inflation Reduction Act in the rollout of solar and those incentives. A couple of other things that are kind of pushing the playing field as well. There's been an effort, again, started under the Obama administration, to put a price on the costs of carbon, called the social cost of carbon, or of other greenhouse gases as well. Under the Obama administration and under the interim guidance under the Biden administration, it's about $50 a ton. EPA has now proposed a price of about $190 a ton. A lot of debate about what the impact of that would be, but certainly it changes some of the cost-benefit analyses that EPA and other agencies will look at in terms of whether the federal government can lease coal from public lands, which is about the source of about 45% of coal production in the United States. Changes the economics in some of these rules when you look at them from a cost-benefit perspective as well. So that will have some impact too. The other piece I mentioned earlier is the Justice 40 initiative, something that President Biden signed, kickstarted early into his administration, with the idea that 40% of the benefits of environmental efforts, such as some of the ones we're talking about here, should flow to environmental justice communities. So historically disadvantaged communities, typically low-income communities, communities of color. And so you see an emphasis on that in terms of where some of the money is flowing under the Inflation Reduction Act. And I'll pick up this notion of equity and justice, and how does that kind of fit into the energy transition as well. So I want to talk a little bit about how does this actually play out in practice. So Liz was kind of giving you the broad trajectory. I'm talking about some administration efforts and some EPA rules that are going to, maybe tilt the playing field even further, or push even further away from coal. But how does this play out kind of day to day? So in Michigan, Governor Whitmer announced a plan for the state to reduce its carbon emissions, a 28% reduction by 2025, a 52% reduction by 2030, and then to be net negative after 2050. Obviously, she's the governor. She can't just wave her hand and make it happen, but it really focuses the minds of people who work in government on these issues, focus the minds of leading emitters on these issues. And so that plays out in the context of utility regulation, which I do a lot of work in Michigan. There are several different utilities. One of the two major utilities in Michigan is DTE Energy. It's both a provider of natural gas and a provider of electricity. And you see there, kind of in the lower peninsula, kind of in the Detroit and Thumb area, is where DTE provides electricity service to 2.2 million customers throughout Southeast Michigan. Michigan law requires utilities to come up with what's called an integrated resource plan. So companies have to come up with a plan that's a 20-year forecast. What is demand going to look like for electricity over the next 5, 10, 15, and 20 years? And how is the company proposing to meet that demand? The law requires the companies to make this proposal every 5 years. And if their proposal gets adopted by regulators, the Michigan Public Service Commission, then that essentially counts as a form of pre-approval for the company's multi-billion-dollar investments. So that's the kind of what's at stake for the utility. The regulators look at what is reasonable and prudent in terms of the utility company's investments, proposed investments, and what's reasonable for customers to pay. These are very long-lived assets. I think Liz made that point, but I want to emphasize that. When you're investing in a coal-fired power plant, many of the coal-fired power plants we have been open for 50 years. Nuclear power plants are kind of pushing, 40 years, talking about even pushing their licenses longer than that. So it's really important to have good plans so that these investments are made wisely. And the company in this case has some objectives, right? They want a safe plan, or reliable, affordable, caring about the community, and that is clean as well. So what happens is then you get a debate. What is the future energy mix going to look like? DTE has a proposed course of action. This basically this is all public. This is being litigated right now. The company's made a proposal, and a number of different entities, the Attorney General, a couple of environmental groups, industry interests are all battling over what is this future going to look like, these investments of billions of dollars. And so the company has a plan which basically has retirements here and here of the major coal-fired power plants, adding wind in later years, and adding a new natural gas plant potentially of some source. Environmentalists say that's not the right way of doing it. They have proposed an alternative proposal, which basically shuts the coal fire. It's a little bit confusing, but basically a little bit of a chart here where I kind of compared the two. Basically, you see that the company wants to close its coal-fired power plant here in 2035. The environmentalists want to close it in 2030. The environmentalists think that the wind that the company wants to build later can be built now. And rather than building that additional gas plant in the future, they want more storage now and more storage in the future, right? Again, lots is turning on this in terms of what's economically prudent, what the environmental impacts will be. This is where it's really getting fought out, right? So the question is, I think the writing is clearly on the wall, right? The company is going to retire these coal-fired power plants. But when is it going to retire these coal-fired power plants? It varies from the plant to plant, but in terms of, there were some estimates done for a couple of these units, right? The estimated public health costs are $250 to $350 million a year. For others, it's $800 million to $1.8 billion in terms of days lost from work, according to asthma and other issues, mortalities, et cetera. So every year matters. How is it going to be converted? Is it going to be converted to another plant that kind of runs all of the time, or only when there's demand? There's a proposal to convert a coal-fired power plant to a gas plant, but is that just going to lock in gas for another couple of decades? Maybe that's a good idea as we're transitioning to renewables. Are we sure that renewables are going to provide the reliability that we need? What about this carbon capture technology? Is it really reliable? How quickly can it be rolled out? What are we going to do? The utility made these investments 20, 30 years ago. The commission said you can recover on these investments. We're basically, a company's going to close those plants earlier than they would otherwise. There's a lot of money that investors put into those plants. Are we going to let the utilities recover those costs? And at what rates? All this plays out in terms of what are the replacements, in terms of renewables. Who's going to own the renewables? Is it going to be owned by the utility, kind of keeping the existing model? Is it going to be owned by third-party owners, including individuals on their rooftops? What's the cost of this compared to some of these other solutions? And then also energy efficiency, obviously, because it's if you never have to use the energy, that is certainly a great savings for the environment. But what's a reasonable level that we can expect of energy efficiency investment? Where should that take place? Commercial, industrial, residential? Should it target low-income communities, et cetera? So this is where it's getting fought out, not just in Michigan, but across the country. Different states have slightly different approaches. Michigan is a place where it's not a total free market. The generating assets are owned by the company that actually delivers the power. And so you get these integrated resource plans, a little bit different in different states. But you have these same kinds of questions and battles taking place. Again, it's not a question, I think really it's not a question of if the energy transition is happening. The question is, how quickly is it actually going to happen? And again, maybe one last point kind of on the equity piece as well. I work with low-income communities of color in and around Detroit, advocating for their communities to get a fair share of this energy transition. So they've made an additional proposal on top of the environmental proposal, basically asking for an even greater subsidy towards the installation of distributed generation, putting money, a significant amount of money towards community solar, so that those individuals who can't put solar on their rooftops because they may be renters or may not have a lot of capital can actually have access to participating in the clean energy transition. Addressing issues of reliability through storage that also provides other benefits in terms of some of the intermittence of renewables. And again, kind of moving forward more quickly to retiring coal and not rewarding the company for what these groups believe was an imprudent investment in these coal assets. So I'm going to stop my sharing here, and maybe this is a point at which Liz and Delita could rejoin for questions.
Thank you, Professor Templeton. Thank you, Professor Moyer, as well. You always learn new things during these Harper lectures, which is why it's so wonderful attending them. So there are over 300 of you on the line. You're a great crowd. We have a lot of questions coming into the chat, a lot of questions that were submitted in advance during the registration process. So we're trying to filter them as much as we can, but trying to cluster them too. So just looking through here. Let's see. Okay, so we've received a bunch of questions on the role of governments. I'm going to bundle a few of them here. Let's see. So one question is, what can large cities do to prepare for the inequality residents will face when dealing with renewables compared to suburban areas? Very interesting question. And what policy would you like to see local governments prioritize? Perhaps turning to Professor Templeton, can you please let us know what your thoughts are about what local governments should be doing?
Right. So a couple of different thoughts here. First is, and this varies from state to state. In some states, there's something called community choice or community aggregation. And that basically allows essentially municipalities to enter into long-term kind of purchase agreements for people who, residents who live in their communities. And they can use that as a form of leverage, either with the existing utilities or buying power for some alternative electric suppliers. And they can, use that in a way that would, purchase renewables or encourage the purchase of storage. So that's one thing that they can do. Some of them also actually own their own municipal utilities. And so if they actually are the owners, then they can work on trying to adopt more renewables or more storage kind of more quickly, or support energy efficiency measures. In that sense, they can also really leverage their balance sheet. I mean, I talked about the way in which they can borrow more cheaply, right, than others, and they can invest in energy efficiency programs. I personally would encourage that investment towards low-income communities. Again, people who may not have the opportunity to make those investments. One other piece also is that sometimes some of the challenges in making those energy efficiency investments turn on issues relating to, sometimes the homes in these communities need a lot of issues, right? And so some of the energy efficiency programs really, mandate fixes to roofs and other things even before the energy efficiency dollars can flow in. So again, to the extent to which the municipalities can help serve a coordinating function and bring together different pieces of the puzzle, I think that's something, again, and then also community solar, right? So again, leveraging the balance sheet and bringing community solar options. Again, I know kind of Michigan, I know Ann Arbor has been at the forefront of trying to bring that to their community.
Okay, great. Professor Moyer, I'm not sure if you want to jump in there. If not, we have some bunch of other questions. Should I go on? Okay. Okay, so so again, super active crowd. I love it. There are a lot of questions on nuclear energy that are coming in, a lot. And so there's a question on what's the role of nuclear energy in the process to replace fossil fuels? Wouldn't it be a quick solution to speed up the transition to a cleaner energy matrix? I'm thinking maybe Professor Moyer, you can take this one on.
So the problem is that nothing about nuclear is quick. The time to new build, even if you start construction right away, is, getting close to a decade. And if you look at the Sankey diagram where we show the evolution of nuclear and how it stagnates, it's actually a little deceptive. Until this year, we had not built a single nuclear plant that was permitted after 1979. So once 3 Mile Island hit in 79, we just stopped permitting new plants. Before the one that was finished this year in Georgia, they had done one, I think 2016 in Tennessee, but that one was originally permitted before 3 Mile Island. So we, in the US anyway, we're just not, socially, for whatever reason, we're not able to do it quickly. And if you look at China, which has weaker environmental regulations, less public input process, there's not as much a reason for nuclear to be slow in China. And they also have not typically, they would love to get off coal. They would love to be energy independent. They would love to be nuclear. And while they have been building out nuclear quite quickly, quicker than any other country, as they've expanded in their energy production, nuclear hasn't really grown in the mix very much. So there's no country that has managed to become all nuclear quickly. France made their entire electric sector nuclear, but that was a very slow process over decades. So that's the problem. Again, we just are not able to do anything with nuclear quick.
Okay, thanks a lot, Professor Moyer. Professor Templeton, I'm not sure if you have anything to add there. If not, we can move on to some other questions. Okay, great. And we're scrolling as fast as we can here through the questions. There's a lot of questions on 2050, net zero 2050. One person also pointed to a April 14th New York Times article that outlines the daunting task to electrify everything by 2050. And the question is, can you comment on the article and how your work will help address the challenges of electrifying the future? Very good question. Turning to Professor Templeton, perhaps, what are your thoughts on electrifying everything? And how does your work relate to that?
I think even as I said at the beginning of the presentation, I think that I'm interested in what my colleague thinks about that too. But I think that's kind of what we need to do, right? We need to be sure that we're continuing to move to lower carbon sources of emissions as we're making that transition, and not using that as a way of justifying keeping these highly polluting coal-fired power plants open unless we can figure out technologies to kind of capture that carbon. But yes, I think as I showed at the beginning, right, it's roughly 25% of emissions are from the electric power sector. That's going to come down with the move to renewables, roughly a little bit more right now in transportation. I don't think we're going to, I'm not an expert in all this. I think there's some which are going to be aspects, maybe aviation fuel, which will be harder to take care of. Maybe some other, look, I mean, petroleum is a great, for better or for worse, it's really what Professor Moyer thinks, but it's a very efficient way of storing a lot of energy. And so there are going to be some uses where that's probably going to persist, but we need to electrify the transportation sector. California is actually in the process of working on rail issues. That can have a big impact again in the environmental justice communities, in rail switching yards. So yes, I think that needs to be done. I think that kind of where that intersects with some of my work is making sure, again, particularly from the perspective of the people who I represent, how do the lower income communities of color who've not had access get access to this in the future? So if we're thinking about upgrading the distribution system so we can electrify everything, how do we make sure that those communities are getting those investments? whether it's in residential electrification, kind of back to the building piece, or electric vehicles or things like that. So we're very mindful of making sure as this transition is happening that it's happening everywhere.
Got it. Okay. Professor Moyer, any thoughts on this?
I'm
On
good.
electrifying everything.
Well,
Okay.
it's the pathway. It's just yeah. I guess my comment is I guess I will make a comment. It's the one that I give to all undergrads when they ask how they can help with climate change and they want to, do something glamorous and protesty usually. And I say you can go to graduate school in the most tedious, nitpicky program you can find that deals with permitting and regulation and zoning and help transmission get built. And that's the best thing you can do. And that sometimes makes a difficult conversation, but it's true, that things have to get built.
Okay. Well, we have a lot of different types of questions here. There was a question that came in on climate change. And there were a lot of questions too in terms of regional, very local questions. And so let's turn to one of those. This person is asking, I live in Minneapolis. On average, Des Moines, Iowa is 7 degrees warmer. Should the planet warm by 2 degrees, Minneapolis temperatures would be like those in Owatonna, Minnesota. Don't know where that is, but Owatonna, Minnesota. I find it challenging to understand how, if temperatures are what we have today, 75 to 100 miles south of here, do we have an existential risk? Perhaps maybe Professor Moyer, do you want to take this one on?
Sure. I think that's a great question, and I'm really happy to take it on because I do think it's challenging to think through why climate change is problematic and why we're so worried about it when, of course, humans live in environments, that span from, the Arctic where it's -50 in the winter and dark all the time to Iraq where it gets to be 140 Fahrenheit in the summer, and we somehow have managed to survive in all that incredible diversity of environments. So why would we care about a couple degrees? And that's a very reasonable question to ask. And there's two answers to that. And one answer is that in many cases, what matters is the rate of change, not the magnitude. That neither ecosystems nor people are comfortable with things changing quickly. And climate impacts our lives and our economy and the food we grow in all kinds of ways we don't recognize. And so even though a change of, a couple degrees over 100 years doesn't seem like much, that's the level of change that produces mass extinctions in the geological record. And so we can see, we showed you the simple example of maize crops moving up to Canada, where of course the soil is worse than it is in the Midwest. And so you have additional impact there. But there's all kinds of cases where water resources moving from one region to another, that long-term wouldn't be a problem, but short-term, when people live somewhere and they need water and they expect to have water and they don't have it anymore, they have to move, right? So there's going to be a lot of disruption that's just occurring because changes happen too quick for rapid adaptation, and people are used to the world the way it is. And so the rate of change is really one of the principal drivers. And then there's other level effects also. Sea level rise is something that is kind of a foregone conclusion. 9 degrees of global change was enough to put us in an ice age. We're talking about going 5 degrees now above where we are now. The last time we were that warm, there was no ice on Antarctica, which if that happens again, that means no Florida. So there's, all kinds of consequences, which are maybe slow, but are inevitable. And then the very practical consequence, the one that is most important, I think, for people is just this question of how are we going to feed everybody? That we feed people on temperate zone crops that really have a very limited temperature range in which they grow. It's very difficult to breed crops for higher heat tolerance. Monsanto has tried. We're already trying to feed 7-8 billion people now in the global population. So the human agriculture has only existed in remarkably stable climate conditions. So that's really the fear. The biggest fears that we have are for those reasons. It doesn't mean that, everything, life on Earth will die if it gets warmer. In fact, the planet has been considerably warmer for most of Earth history. But rapid change, that we're not ready when we have a system that expects conditions to be the way they are now, and when we are a highly populated planet where people are used to agriculture that's been developed in a relatively stable climate, those are tough things. So sorry if that was a long answer, but I know a lot of people are interested in climate, and I really do think it's very challenging to wrap your head around why these seemingly small changes can be big in their impact. So it's important.
No, thanks a lot for your detailed response to that question, because I think it's a lot of people are thinking about these issues, and they do want to, they are trying to figure out, these are small numbers here and there. How is this really going to have an effect, and what is the impact really? And what is the impact to our daily lives? So thank you for that. Professor Templeton, I'm not sure if you have anything to add to that. If not, we do actually have time for a few more questions.
Let's take them.
All right, let's go. So how about, there are a lot of questions in the chat on renewables, solar,
the chat is full of good questions.
Yeah, I know, so many.
I was going to type my answers, but it won't let me.
And you all really like to write a lot, so we're trying to read these. So let me package one of them, or let me pull out one of them. We had a question about some of the opportunities and challenges of building and deploying renewables. Good one. It's tax related too. While tax incentives are the main reason developers are able to afford to build renewables, they are also creating complexity in financing and development. Is there concern that this complexity will hinder the growth of the industry? Perhaps Mark, what are your thoughts on this?
I'm not a huge expert on this particular issue, although we work a bit with people who are involved in back to kind of Liz's point, in terms of actually developers and people are getting permits to get these things done. I hear that complexity. I also hear people saying that there's a lot of money now out there for these purposes. Obviously, additional funds kind of coming through the Inflation Reduction Act. There's some questions about how does that affect what kind of entities can actually receive these funds, some kind of complicated tax questions. I guess I believe that where there's money, there's a way. Maybe that's not a fully satisfactory answer, and it would be good to remove other frictions. I firmly believe that. I do think there's another piece of this too, which is about, for some of the larger projects, interconnections. So there's this big question about kind of relates to the transmission point that Liz was making in a slightly different way, which is, you can build wind and solar, but you actually have to get them on the transmission network. So first of all, you have to have transmission to get the power from one place to another. But even then, there's kind of a queue because there's so many projects being proposed. And the regional transmission organizations, which kind of sit between the states and between the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, have kind of which coordinate transmission and I would say on projects and run energy markets, are really kind of working through these issues. And there's some problems now where there's even gamesmanship because it's kind of so hard to get through. People may be putting projects in because they think a certain percentage of projects are going to get knocked out. So we really need to, I'm not disagreeing with the question at all. I guess what I'm saying is that there's some other challenges, maybe back to what Liz was saying as well about, how do we get these projects permitted, in particular, sited, permitted, get them onto the transmission system. So look, it's an exciting time. I mean, I understand the clouds, but I think energy transitions are very exciting. And so it's going to be complicated working through this.
Okay, thanks a lot.
I could also just pull a couple questions off the chat if that helps.
Sure, go for it.
So many good questions. Okay, someone says, what impact does global warming have on the Great Lakes region? The answer is the Great Lakes region is not typically, we are not one of the largest places of concern in terms of global warming. And so my usual tagline when I talk about it is saying that the impact on the Great Lakes region will be that like lots of people move here from other places that have been impacted. A lot of people are asking about renewables and reliability, and the answer to that is, there's no proposal that doesn't involve gas backup right now. Like that's what we're going to do until we have a reasonable means of energy storage. And so like nobody is proposing to build an energy system, electricity system that is unreliable. And of course, gas backup means everything's expensive because you have to have the capability of backing up. So that's just, how it is. And someone asked why transmission and not production. And the answer is because at least in our current environment, building transmission is harder than building new generation. It's just every transmission line needs permission from every jurisdiction underneath that line. And even though we have national laws that allow you to designate a priority transmission corridor, and so in theory, you could use eminent domain and seize land, in practice, people don't want to do that. So we have the Saudi Arabia of wind with no means of getting it out to the places where people want to use that energy.
I agree 100%, and that's partly because of the way I would argue the courts actually interpreted an earlier provision that I think, I'm not sure I agree with that interpretation. I think that we are working through some of these things in maybe less than optimal ways. So, for example, I was the regulator in a regulator in Missouri. There was a proposal to basically run wind from Kansas through Missouri. Wind power from Kansas through Missouri and deposited in Illinois. And they weren't able to do that because people in Missouri weren't benefiting. So at expense, the municipality, I believe, in Columbia, Missouri, or the Municipal Power Association had members who took some of the power in Missouri, which allowed them to do this. Now, I'm not going to say that's economically efficient, but I am going to say that kind of, where there's a will, there's a way to try to solve some of these problems. Now, obviously, it imposes costs, and it's going to, make other projects not work for those kinds of things. If I can pick up a question for a second.
Sure, go ahead.
How sustainable are the regulatory changes implemented by the EPA to changes in administration between political parties? Great question. We have seen a big pendulum swing from one administration to another. What I hear when I'm in conversation with industry are a couple of things. One, they want regulatory certainty. And two, some of these changes become hard to undo. Now, so for example, in the context, we're having this big debate back to Michigan, should the company be required to close the coal-fired power plant sooner, but then come back and ask for permission if it needs to keep the plant open longer for reliability purposes? Or should the company keep the plant open longer, but study the possibility of trying to close it actually sooner? And one of the questions is, if you actually require the regulators or whatever, require the plant to close sooner, a lot of things are going to start to happen, right? Maybe the company will start investing less in operations and maintenance, right? Things that you're needed to really keep the power plant up and running won't be done. Company won't invest in expensive and necessary pollution control technologies. What's going to happen to the mines that are providing the coal? Are they going to start to plan to shut down? So some of these things start to get locked in because of the business reasons, even if one administration can change kind of 180 degrees.
Thank you, Professor Templeton. And to my UChicago friends out there, we have the privilege of having these two professors, and you see the different perspectives and the way they answer these questions. And that's why it's so wonderful having a professor in the law school and a professor in geophysical sciences. I'm really enjoying this. I hope you're all having fun as well. We have maybe time for one more question. And I think this is maybe just the two of you, very UChicago oriented. Is UChicago expanding its curriculum in this area of climate change, renewable energy, and such to prepare future leaders in this area? Maybe perhaps very briefly before we close the show, either of you can jump in on this one.
So I just got out of a 2-hour faculty meeting today where we were talking about hiring new instructional faculty and expanding our offerings because of the demand. Students literally can't get enough environmental science classes right now. And we just hired, I think we have 5 new faculty who will be joining us next year. So So it's certainly a lot of growth, and we're definitely interested. There's been a schism at UChicago between sort of environmental studies from a humanities perspective and environmental sciences from the science perspective, and that's been a problem, I think, at the university, and we're really trying to bring that together now. So I think there's more movement in undergraduate education to try to fill in that middle space where maybe students don't need to be physics majors, but they're not just reading literature. There's something they want to do in the middle, more almost a geography focus. And I think that that's also growing rapidly. So at least on the undergraduate side, I think there has been a lot of growth, and there will be a lot of more growth.
I'm seeing huge demand. So I teach law students through the practice of law. So we represent individuals and organizations on energy transition issues, kind of traditional environmental Clean Water Act, citizen suits, and things like that. We're trying to train as many people as we possibly can. I've been growing the staff of lawyers that works with me. The law school has added 2 faculty members in the past couple of years. Josh Macy, who really focuses on energy and a bit on environment. Professor Ha-Jin Kim, who's an environment person, but you can't be an environment person without focusing on climate change. So, in terms of scholarship, we're at the cutting edge. That also attracts students who are interested in this topic already. And I'm also just seeing, I think, as Professor Moyer was saying, great collaboration across the university. When I first got here, Liz and I collaborated on a very practical project, challenging a kind of bizarre coal gasification project that made no sense at all.
It made sense to the person who was going to line their pockets with the money. That's what it made sense for.
Well, from our scholarly and economic and scientific perspectives, it made no sense. And we're just seeing more and more of those collaborations. And it's really been wonderful to engage students in those who have practical experience.
Thank you. That's really fabulous to hear from both of you. I'm really happy to hear that. One question for me that I asked President Elisabeth, president of the university, first time I met him, Latka or Hamantashen? to the 2 of you.
I would go for
Latka. About it.
That's my personal preference.
Okay.
Latkas.
All right. Well, those of you who are entrenched in the University of Chicago culture all know about the Latka Hamantashen debate. In any case, we have had a great time this evening. We need to close it. Thank you so much to Liz and Mark. Thanks to all of you for your wonderful questions. We literally had hundreds of questions. And so our only regret is we couldn't get through them all tonight. But I think we did as much as we could within the hour that we had. It was a pleasure to spend some time exploring the life of the mind with all of you this evening. We talked about electrifying the future. I hope you found this lecture and these presentations to be electrifying. Thank you all for coming together to celebrate the University of Chicago community this evening. Thank you again so much to Professors Moyer and Templeton, and enjoy the rest of your week.